I don't usually tell this story. It's something that I've kept to myself for years, only sharing it with those who are willing to listen. But the more time passes, the more I feel the need to speak. It might help me, or perhaps it might help someone else. I don't know. All I can say is, be careful of the things you can't explain. It all started back in the autumn of 1982. I was living in a little cottage on the edge of a small village, a quiet place where nothing ever really happened, the kind of place where you could hear the wind in the trees and the rustle of leaves in the evening. I lived alone, which suited me just fine. I'd always been that way, content in my own company. One evening, as the sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields, I noticed something unusual. From my kitchen window, I could see the house across the way, the charming little farmhouse that had been vacant for years, the kind of house that never looked like it should be empty, always giving off a peculiar vibe, even when I was younger. I'd never seen anyone go in or out of it, and I always wondered who would want to live there. That evening, I saw someone in the window, a woman standing perfectly still, just staring out across the fields. Now, mind you, there was no one supposed to be there. The house had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, and I was certain no one had moved in. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows had fallen, or perhaps I was just imagining things. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd glance out my kitchen window, and there she'd be, always in the same spot, always standing there, looking out as though waiting for something, waiting for someone. The thing is, she never moved, not once, and no matter how often I looked, I couldn't make out her face clearly. There was just a vague outline of a figure, a woman in a long dress. Sometimes her silhouette seemed to flicker, as though she was there one moment and gone the next. It was disconcerting, to say the least. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The wind playing tricks, perhaps. The way light moved at dusk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just the figure in the window. It was the sense of presence. Something lurking just beyond the edges of my understanding. Just out of reach. Then one evening I made the mistake of doing something foolish. I decided to go over to the house. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I thought if I got a closer look, maybe it would ease my mind. Perhaps there was a simple explanation, like someone had moved in without me noticing, a neighbor's niece visiting, or someone tending to the house. I stood at the front gate, my heart thudding in my chest. It had been so many years since I'd walked up that path, and the overgrown garden felt as though it were closing in on me. The door was ajar, just a crack. I don't know why I didn't turn back then, but I didn't. I stepped inside. The air was stale, musty, as though the house hadn't been lived in for a very long time. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the rooms, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. I walked through the house calling out, but there was no answer, no sign of anyone. But when I reached the room at the back, where the window always was, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the woman. But she wasn't like the figure I had seen from my kitchen window. She was different. She was real. She had long dark hair that cascaded down her back, and a pale, almost translucent face that stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Her dress, once white, was now stained and ragged, as though it had been weathered by time itself. And she wasn't alone. There in the corner of the room was a chair, rocking back and forth. No one was sitting in it, yet the motion was unmistakable. It creaked with each movement, like something, or someone, was trying to get comfortable in it. I remember feeling cold, so cold. My breath came out in clouds even though it was a warm evening outside. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint at first but growing louder, clearer. She's waiting. It wasn't in my head. No. It was as if the voice was coming from the walls themselves, from the very air in the room. I turned to leave, but before I could move, the woman reached out. A skeletal hand, as though she had been waiting for me. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was back in my cottage, my heart pounding so loud. In my chest, I thought I might collapse. I couldn't get the image of her out of my mind. The way she stood there, silent and still, with those empty eyes. I never went back to that house, of course. But sometimes late at night, I think I hear something. A creaking floorboard. The sound of a chair rocking gently back and forth in the dark. And when I'm standing at my window, I swear, I catch a glimpse